My name is Clara Whitford, and on the day my younger sister Jenna became a board-certified neurosurgeon at Johns Hopkins, she looked me straight in the eye and told me that my life's work was nothing more than a stain on the family legacy. It is currently 2:14 a.m., the kind of hour where the silence of my small apartment in Colorado Springs feels like a physical weight, and the hum of the refrigerator is the only thing keeping me grounded as I stare at the legal summons resting on my mahogany coffee table. I am 34 years old, a master sergeant in the United States Air Force with 2 combat deployments to the Middle East under my belt, and a collection of titanium plates in my hip from an IED blast that ended my field career but left me with a permanent dull ache that reminds me of who I am every time the weather turns cold. I remember the smell of the courthouse hallway so vividly that it makes my stomach turn even now. It smelled of industrial floor wax and the metallic tang of old radiator heat. Jenna stood there, draped in a charcoal gray Max Mara wool coat that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment on the modest home I bought with my VA loan. Her hair was perfectly blown out, not a single strand out of place, contrasting sharply with my own utilitarian ponytail and the slight limp I can never quite hide when I am tired. We were standing on the cold, polished marble of the Fairfax County Courthouse, surrounded by the echoes of other people's ruined lives, but the only ruins I cared about were the ones sitting between us. "You're just a glorified government servant, Clara," Jenna had sneered, her voice dropping to a pitch of condescension that felt like a serrated blade across my skin. "My career saves lives. Yours just destroys them. This money was a gift for my sacrifice, not a debt." As she spoke, I felt the familiar phantom throb in my lower back. A souvenir from a dusty road outside Kandahar where I had risked everything to ensure she never had to know what a day of real hunger felt like. I looked at this woman, this elite surgeon who lived in a penthouse overlooking the inner harbor, and I tried to find the little girl I used to shield from our father's drunken rages in a rusted-out 1998 Fleetwood trailer in rural Virginia. I had spent 15 years of my life pouring every cent of my hazardous duty pay, my re-enlistment bonuses, and my meager savings into her future. I had funded her $280,000 medical education to the last cent. I had lived on MREs and slept on cots so she could have a tuition-paid ride through Georgetown and then specialized residency training. I had skipped my own surgeries to ensure her wire transfers cleared on time. When she needed a 2022 Audi Q5 to look the part for her internship, I was the one who signed the checks while I drove a beat-up 2012 Ford F-150 with a failing transmission. I thought I was building a bridge for our family to cross into a better life, but as I stood in that hallway, I realized I had only built a pedestal for a monster to stand on. The betrayal was not just in the money she refused to acknowledge as a loan, despite the notarized agreement we signed 6 years ago when she was crying about her mounting debt. The betrayal was in the way she looked at my uniform with disgust, as if the service that had paid for her very existence was beneath her. She stood there with her legal team, 2 men in tailored navy suits carrying Toomey briefcases, while I stood alone with my truth and a folder of bank statements. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand why my sister thinks my sacrifice was a gift, I have to take you back to the moment the first check was written, and the moment I realized that blood doesn't make you family, it just makes you a target. I am a soldier by trade and a protector by nature, but I am finally learning that the most dangerous enemies aren't the ones in the tree-line. They are the ones you fed from your own plate while you went hungry. The gritty reality of my existence was measured in sand, sweat, and $15 MREs that tasted like salt and cardboard, a stark contrast to the world I was meticulously building for Jenna back home. While I was stationed at Al Udeid Air Base, sleeping in a reinforced tent where the thermometer regularly hit a blistering 110 degrees by noon and the air conditioning unit groaned like a dying beast, I was calculating every cent of my hazardous duty pay to ensure her life remained untouched by the filth of our upbringing. I lived on a strict budget that allowed me no luxuries, skipping the occasional morale-boosting base exchange trips just to ensure that Jenna could reside in a luxury $3,200 a month apartment in the uptown district of Dallas, a place with floor-to-ceiling windows and a rooftop pool that I paid for without a second thought. I was a master sergeant with a mission that extended far beyond the flight line. My mission was her success, even if it meant my own stagnation. I remember the pride I felt when she called to tell me she needed a car for her residency rotations, a request that led me to sign a $48,000 loan for a pristine, glacier white 2023 Audi A5 with nougat brown leather interior and every technological bell and whistle available. I told myself she needed to look professional, that a surgeon couldn't show up in a junker, Even as I continued to drive my battered 2012 Ford F-150 with a jagged lightning bolt crack stretching across the windshield and a digital odometer that had long ago passed the 180,000-mile mark. Every time I turned the key in that truck and heard the engine struggle to turn over, I thought of her gliding silently through Texas traffic in German-engineered comfort, and I felt a sense of martyrdom that I mistook for love. My wardrobe consisted of faded OCP uniforms for work and a rotating selection of 3 pairs of thrift store jeans and $5 clearance shirts for my rare days off, all because I refused to let her feel the pinch of her own ambition. I vividly recall standing in a dusty corner of a shipping container, scrolling through a digital storefront to order her $1,200 oncology textbooks and specialized surgical kits, the cost of which was more than my entire monthly grocery budget. I felt a twisted sense of accomplishment every time a charge from the Georgetown University bookstore hit my USA account, seeing it as an investment in a future where one of us finally made it out of the mud. I didn't care that my combat boots were worn through the soles or that I was treating my chronic hip pain with over-the-counter ibuprofen because I couldn't afford the copay for private physical therapy outside the military system. I was the invisible architect of her brilliance, the woman in the shadows who wore the same worn-out sneakers for 3 years so Jenna could walk the hospital halls in $500 ergonomic clogs designed for elite medical professionals. But as I sat in that courthouse later, looking at her polished exterior, I realized that while I was saving every penny of my combat pay to buy her a life of prestige, she was using that same money to buy a coffin for our relationship. She didn't see the grit under my fingernails or the permanent lines of exhaustion etched around my eyes from working double shifts on the flight line. She only saw a bank account that had finally run dry. Now, as the memory of those sweltering desert nights clashes with the icy coldness of her betrayal, I realize that the sacrifice wasn't just financial. It was the slow, deliberate erasure of my own worth for the sake of a sister who viewed my blood, sweat, and tears as nothing more than her birthright. Family isn't about the sacrifices you make in silence. It is about whether the person you saved is willing to look back and pull you up, or if they prefer to step on your shoulders to reach a higher branch. The clock on the wall of my empty kitchen read exactly 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday when the world I had meticulously constructed out of discipline and sacrifice finally collapsed into a heap of digital zeros. I had just returned from my final deployment, the smell of jet fuel and desert dust still clinging to my flight bag, and the first thing I did after dropping my gear was log into our joint emergency savings account to begin planning my transition into civilian life. This was the account where I had tucked away $85,000 over a decade of service, every penny earned through hazardous duty pay reenlistment bonuses, and the grueling overtime of a master sergeant who never took a day off. I expected to see the familiar comfort of a 5-figure balance that would fund my hip surgery and a modest down payment on a quiet home, but instead, the glowing screen of my laptop mocked me with a balance of $12.43. The transaction history was a roadmap of a calculated theft, showing a single massive transfer executed 3 weeks prior to an entity listed as Zenith Tech Solutions, a failing startup owned by Jenna's latest boyfriend, Lucas, a man who wore $1,500 suits but couldn't cover his own office rent. My heart hammered against my ribs with a violence I hadn't felt since the IED blast in Kandahar, a rhythmic thrumming of disbelief that my own flesh and blood could gut my future while I was still wearing a uniform in a combat zone. I didn't call her. I drove straight to the Gilded Leaf, a high-end bistro in downtown Baltimore where I knew she spent her long lunch breaks draped in luxury and filtered through the adulation of her peers. When I walked in, the hostess looked at my faded flight jacket and worn tactical boots with a sneer that matched the one I was about to receive from my sister. Jenna was sitting at a corner table bathed in soft amber light, looking every bit the prestigious neurosurgeon in a cream silk blouse that cost more than my monthly grocery allowance. She didn't flinch when I slammed my phone onto the white linen tablecloth, the screen still displaying the $12 balance. She didn't apologize, she didn't offer an explanation, and she certainly didn't show a flicker of the shame I expected to see in the eyes of the girl I had raised. Instead, she reached out with a manicured hand, picked up a $16 espresso martini garnished with a single gold leaf, and took a slow, deliberate sip before letting out a sharp, melodic laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "You're military, Clara," she said, her voice dripping with a condescension so thick it felt like a physical weight in the room. "You'll always have a pension and your little government benefits to fall back on, so don't act like this is a tragedy. I needed this capital to actually be someone to help Lucas launch a vision that actually changes the world, Unlike your career, which is just about following orders and maintaining a status quo that nobody cares about. She looked at me not as a sister who had saved her life 1,000 times over, but as a resource that had finally been depleted. At that moment, the $62 steak on her plate and the designer handbag resting on the chair beside her felt like they were made of my own skin and bone. I realized then that my sister didn't see my $85,000 as a loan or even a gift. She saw it as her reparations for having a sister who was a mere servant of the state. As I stood there in that hushed, expensive room, the realization settled into my marrow that the war I had been fighting abroad was nothing compared to the one that had just begun at home, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to protect her from the consequences of her own actions. The night air in the parking lot of a 24-hour Denny's off Interstate 25 was thick with the smell of old frying oil and the damp, heavy scent of impending rain. I sat behind the wheel of my rattling Ford F-150, the dashboard lights flickering in sympathy with the buzzing neon sign above the diner that cast a rhythmic, sickly yellow glow over my steering wheel. My hands were still shaking from the encounter at the bistro, a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air and everything to do with the shattering of a 34-year delusion. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a single grease-stained paper napkin, smoothing it out over my knee with a hand that had once held a tourniquet steady under heavy fire but now struggled to hold a cheap ballpoint pen. I drew a jagged, uncompromising line down the center of that fragile piece of paper, creating 2 columns that represented the wreckage of my life. On the left side I wrote the words family loyalty in a cramped, disciplined script, and on the right I wrote the truth in letters that felt heavy and final. For 12 long years, across 3 different continents and more sandstorms than I could count, I had functioned as a human shield for a woman who viewed my protection as a basic utility. I looked at the left column and saw the ghost of the little girl I had pulled out of the path of our father's drunken rage, the girl whose tears I had wiped away with the hem of my hand-me-down shirts in that drafty Fleetwood trailer. I had believed that by absorbing every blow the world aimed at her, I was giving her the freedom to become something great, a healer who would bring honor to a name that had previously only been associated with poverty and failure. But as I stared at the right column, the truth hit me with the force of a kinetic strike. By insulating Jenna from every hardship and paying for every mistake with my own blood and sweat, I hadn't raised a brilliant doctor or a grateful sister. I had spent nearly $300,000 in a decade of my youth funding the evolution of a monster who lacked the basic human capacity for empathy or remorse. The love I had carried like a sacred relic was revealed to be nothing more than a one-way transaction, a predatory drainage of my soul and my bank account that she felt entitled to simply because she considered her intellect superior to my service. I realized then that while I was sleeping on a dirt floor in a combat zone to save for her textbooks, she was laughing at my sacrifice behind my back with people like Lucas who had never worked a day in their lives. I crumpled the napkin into a tight ball and threw it onto the floorboards of the truck, feeling a cold, predatory clarity settle over me that I usually only felt before a high-stakes mission. I pulled out my iPhone 14, the screen cracked but functional, and created a new encrypted digital folder in my cloud drive, labeling it in all capital letters, Reckoning. Inside that folder, I began to upload the evidence I had been unknowingly collecting for years out of a habit of military precision. I uploaded the scanned copies of the notarized loan agreement Jenna had signed when she was desperate for tuition, the bank statements showing the $85,000 theft to Zenith Tech Solutions, and the years of text messages where she promised to repay every cent once she made surgeon. I wasn't just a big sister anymore. I was a master sergeant conducting a post-action report on a betrayal, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to retreat or provide cover fire for her escape. Jenna wanted to be someone who changed the world, but she was about to learn that the world has a very specific way of correcting those who build their empires on the stolen lives of others. The silence of the parking lot was no longer empty. It was the quiet before the breach, and as I shifted the truck into gear, I knew that the version of Clara Whitford who prioritized family blood over her own dignity was officially dead and buried in the Colorado soil. I didn't scream, and I didn't send a single impulsive text message that could be used against me in the cold, sterile environment of a courtroom. Instead, I woke up at 0430 hours the next morning, polished my low quarters until they reflected the harsh fluorescent lights of my kitchen, and went to work at the base with the same mechanical precision that had kept me alive in the Middle East. My rage was no longer a fire. It had cooled into a pressurized hydraulic force, contained and directed toward a single objective: total accountability. 3 days later, I found myself sitting in a high-backed wing chair in the office of Elias Thorne, a retired JAG colonel turned private litigator whose reputation for dismantling white-collar arrogance was legendary in the DMV area. His office was tucked away in a converted brownstone in Old Town Alexandria, smelling heavily of Davidoff Winston Churchill cigars and the sweet musty scent of centuries-old leather-bound law books. Elias didn't look like a savior. He looked like an undertaker for the ambitious, with silver hair cropped in a strict high-end titan eyes that scanned my documentation with the predatory focus of a hawk. We spent 14 grueling days in that office, fueled by bitter black coffee and the singular drive to construct what Elias called the arsenal. This was not a mere collection of grievances. It was a 4-inch thick physical manifestation of my sister's exploitation of my life. We meticulously organized 72 monthly bank statements from my USAA and Navy federal accounts, highlighting every single transfer that had flowed toward Jenna's lifestyle since 2012. We retrieved the original notarized $45,000 tuition loan agreement she had signed in 2018 in a moment of panic when her residency funding had stalled, a document she likely assumed I had lost in one of my many permanent change of station moves. I sat at his mahogany desk for hours, exporting 412 saved text messages from my encrypted cloud backup, threads where she had explicitly promised to repay every dime with interest once she reached her chief residency year. The most damning piece of the arsenal, however, was the digital breadcrumb trail we uncovered leading directly to Lucas's failing LLC, Zenith Tech Solutions. Elias hired a forensic accountant who traced the $85,000 theft through 3 different intermediary accounts before it landed in a business payroll account used to pay for Lucas's office lease and a company retreat to Cabo San Lucas. Seeing the dates of those transfers, the exact days I was conducting perimeter checks in a dust storm, made the metallic taste of betrayal sharpen in my mouth. We didn't just have evidence. We had a chronological map of a predator who had used her sister's combat pay to fund a boyfriend's delusions of grandeur. Elias flipped through the final bound stack of papers, his thumb catching on the edge of the notarized signature Jenna had scribbled years ago, and he gave me a grim professional nod that signaled the end of my role as a victim. The paper trail was heavy, a physical weight that represented my missing hip cartilage, my sleepless nights in a tent, and the decade of my youth I could never get back. I realized as I left his office that Jenna had always underestimated me because she mistook my silence for weakness and my service for lack of intellect. She thought she was the only one in the family who understood how to use the system to her advantage, but she had forgotten that I was trained by the most powerful system in the world to identify a threat and neutralize it. As I walked to my truck, the weight of the arsenal in my briefcase felt like a loaded weapon, and for the first time since I touched down on American soil, I felt like the commander of my own destiny again. The battle lines were drawn, and Jenna was about to find out that a soldier who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous opponent she will ever face. Jenna made the tactical error of assuming I would play defense, so she decided to strike first by filing a lawsuit against me for financial coercion, a desperate attempt to void our legal contracts and clear her credit history so she and Lucas could secure a $1.2 million mortgage for a colonial-style mansion in Great Falls. She didn't just want my money. She wanted to surgically remove me from her life like a tumor, and to ensure my social execution was complete, she invited our entire extended family to what she called her victory hearing. My aunts, uncles, and cousins sat in the gallery of the courtroom, whispered voices echoing off the wood-paneled walls, while Jenna leaned over to them and described me as a bitter, shell-shocked soldier who was trying to sabotage the career of a brilliant surgeon out of pure professional jealousy. She was a master of optics, dressed in a $900 navy blue theory suit with a crisp white silk blouse and discreet diamond studs that screamed understated success, looking every bit the victim of a deranged older sister. I didn't arrive in civilian clothes to play the part of the grieving sibling. I arrived in my full Air Force service dress uniform, every silver button aligned, every ribbon from my 2 deployments to the Middle East perfectly centered, and my Master Sergeant stripes sharp enough to cut glass. My Purple Heart and Commendation medals were polished to a mirror finish, a silent testament to the physical price I had paid while she was at wine mixers in Baltimore. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with a measured rhythmic pace that masked the persistent ache in my reconstructed hip, and in my right hand, I carried the heavy black leather binder containing the arsenal like it was a loaded weapon ready for a breach. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old paper and the sharp clinical perfume Jenna always wore, But as I sat down at the defense table next to Elias Thorne, I felt a cold, predatory stillness settle over me that I had only ever felt in the moments before a mission went hot. Jenna didn't even look at me. She was too busy performing for our relatives, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief as her high-priced attorney began a monologue about the emotional toll my supposed harassment had taken on her medical practice. He painted a picture of a predatory older sister who had forced a young, vulnerable medical student into predatory loan agreements, conveniently ignoring the fact that those loans were the only reason she wasn't still living in a trailer park. Our Aunt Martha looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. Her lips pursed as she bought into the narrative that I was a broken woman seeking revenge for a life I chose to lead. They all saw the uniform as a sign of my instability rather than a symbol of the discipline that was about to dismantle Jenna's carefully constructed lie piece by piece. Elias leaned over and whispered that it was time to let the paper do the talking, and as I opened the binder, the sound of the rings clicking open felt like the safety being switched off on a rifle. I watched Jenna's smug expression falter for a fraction of a second when she saw the sheer volume of the evidence we had compiled, the 4-inch stack of bank statements and notarized signatures that she thought had disappeared into the fog of my deployments. She had brought a knife to a gunfight, armed only with her ego and a designer suit, while I had brought a decade of documented betrayal and the unwavering resolve of a woman who had survived much worse than a courtroom drama. The victory she had promised our family was about to turn into a public autopsy of her character, and as the judge called the session to order, I looked at the little sister I once loved and realized that the only thing more dangerous than a soldier with a mission is a sister who has finally stopped being a shield. The atmosphere inside courtroom 4B was suffocating, thick with the scent of floor wax and the heavy, judgmental silence of a family that had already decided I was the villain of the story. Judge Martha Harper sat perched behind her elevated mahogany bench, her spine as straight as a bayonet and her eyes like polished flint as she peered over the rims of her reading glasses. Jenna's attorney, a man with a $5,000 smile and a voice like velvet, paced the floor while calling me a manipulative predator who had used my military rank to coerce a vulnerable medical student into financial servitude. He spoke of my deployments as if they were a psychological defect, painting a picture of a broken soldier who couldn't handle her sister's success and was now clawing at her hard-earned reputation. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the defense table, feeling the weight of my service medals against my chest as I watched my aunts and uncles nod in agreement with every poisonous word he uttered. Then Elias Thorne stood up, and the energy in the room shifted from a performance to an execution. He didn't raise his voice and he didn't offer a dramatic rebuttal. Instead, he moved with the clinical efficiency of a man who had seen 1,000 liars crumble under the weight of their own signatures. He pulled the first set of documents from my black binder and began a silent, methodical distribution to the judge and the opposing counsel, his footsteps the only sound in the cavernous room. Page 1 was the opening volley, the original notarized 2018 contract Jenna had signed in a frantic rush of desperation, clearly stating that the $45,000 for her specialized surgical training was a loan to be repaid with 5% interest. I watched the color drain from Jenna's face as she realized I had kept the physical copy she thought she had shredded 3 years ago during a holiday visit. Elias didn't stop there. He turned the room into a theater of her own making by presenting page 15, a high-resolution printout of a text message thread from 14 months ago. In it, Jenna had explicitly referred to me as her personal ATM, joking with Lucas about how she could always guilt me into another wire transfer by mentioning our dead mother's wishes. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sharp, audible clatter of my Aunt Sarah dropping her gold-rimmed glasses onto the hardwood floor in pure, unadulterated shock. The narrative of the golden child, the healer, and the pride of the Whitford family began to dissolve in real time, replaced by the image of a common thief who wore a designer suit bought with stolen combat pay. Finally, Elias reached the killing blow on page 40. The forensic accounting trail that mapped the $85,000 theft from our joint emergency account directly into the payroll coffers of Zenith Tech Solutions. The paper trail showed the exact timestamp of the transfer. A moment when I was literally under fire in a remote outpost, trusting that my future was safe because my sister was the one holding the key. I watched Judge Harper's eyes move from the bank statements to Jenna, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Jenna was no longer the prestigious neurosurgeon. She was a predator caught in the bright lights of a truth she thought she was too smart to face. My family, the people who had spent the last hour whispering about my mental stability, were now staring at the back of Jenna's head with a mixture of horror and realization. The golden child was finally visible for exactly what she was. A hollow vessel of ambition that had been fueled by my blood until there was nothing left to give. As Elias sat back down, he leaned over and whispered that the breach was complete, and I realized that for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't the one carrying the burden of our family's shame. It was 2:48 p.m. on a Tuesday and the war was finally coming to an end. The courtroom air felt suddenly thin as Judge Martha Harper leaned forward, her silver-rimmed glasses catching the harsh overhead light like two small mirrors of judgment. "Miss Whitford," she began, her voice dropping with the heavy, final resonance of a gavel hitting a sounding block, "this isn't financial coercion, nor is it the result of a soldier's misplaced bitterness. This is a mountain of undeniable debt and a clear, documented pattern of what appears to be calculated embezzlement from a sibling who was serving in a combat zone." I watched the muscle in Jenna's jaw twitch, her manicured hand trembling as it rested on the mahogany defense table next to a leather folder that now looked pathetically empty compared to our arsenal. Judge Harper didn't just dismiss my sister's frivolous lawsuit with a wave of her hand. She went for the throat of the deception by ordering an immediate freeze on all joint assets and specifically referring the $85,000 unauthorized transfer to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office for a full criminal investigation. Jenna's face turned a sickening ashen shade of gray, a color I had only ever seen on the battlefield in the faces of those who realized too late that their perimeter had been breached and there was no extraction coming. She looked toward the back of the room, her eyes darting frantically as if searching for the man who had been the architect of her greed, but the seat next to my Aunt Sarah was already empty. Lucas, the man who had whispered promises of a $1.2 million lifestyle while spending my hazardous duty pay, hadn't even stayed to hear the final ruling. He had slipped out of the heavy oak back doors of courtroom 4B like a shadow before the hearing had even concluded. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the frantic scratching of the court reporter's steno machine and the heavy, ragged breathing of a sister who was finally realizing that her white coat would not protect her from the consequences of her own theft. I stood there in my service dress uniform, the silver Master Sergeant stripes on my sleeves feeling like the only solid thing in a world that was rapidly shifting for the rest of my family. I didn't feel the rush of joy I had expected, but rather a cold, clinical sense of mission accomplishment that was tinged with the mourning of a relationship that had been dead for a decade. My Aunt Martha, who had spent the morning whispering about my supposed instability, now looked at the floor as if the polished wood held some secret explanation for how her golden niece could be a common criminal. The judge's clerk began stamping the official orders, the rhythmic thud of the ink pad sounding like a drumbeat marking the end of Jenna's reign of entitlement. The freeze on the assets meant the down payment for the mansion in Great Falls was gone, the Audi Q5 was effectively a debt she could no longer hide, and the prestige she had traded my life for was dissolving in the public record of a Fairfax County courtroom. Jenna finally looked at me, her eyes wet with a mixture of terror and a lingering, toxic resentment, but I didn't look away or offer the shield of my protection as I had done since we were children in that rusted trailer. I had funded her education, her car, her luxury apartment, and her vanity, but I was no longer interested in paying the bill for her soul. As the bailiff announced the recess, I picked up my black binder, the 4 inches of paper now a recorded history of my survival, and walked out of the room with the measured, steady gait of a soldier who had finally secured the home front. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary, but as I passed the empty chair where Lucas had sat, I knew that for some, family is just a resource to be mined until the ground collapses, and I was finally standing on solid earth again. The fallout was surgical, a precise and cold dismantling of a life built on the foundations of my silent suffering and the hazardous duty pay I had earned in the dust of the Middle East. Without my monthly subsidies to prop up the illusion of her grandeur, Jenna's world began to hemorrhage with a speed that was almost clinical in its efficiency. Within 30 days of the court-ordered asset freeze, the pristine glacier-white 2023 Audi A5 with its nougat-brown leather interior was repossessed from the hospital parking lot in broad daylight, leaving the prestigious neurosurgeon to call a rideshare while her colleagues watched from the lobby windows. Lucas, the man who had whispered sweet promises of a $1.2 million estate in Great Falls, proved to be exactly the mercenary I suspected. He dumped her the very moment the Zenith Tech Solutions startup funds were locked by the Commonwealth Attorney, disappearing into the digital ether with the same cowardice he had shown when he slipped out of the courtroom back door. Jenna was stripped of her elite status at Johns Hopkins as the criminal investigation into the $85,000 embezzlement gained momentum, and she was ultimately forced to accept a position at a struggling rural clinic 3 states away in the humid backwoods of Mississippi, a place where the salary was a fraction of her former potential, and the court began to systematically garnish her wages to repay the mountain of debt she owed to my USA account. The most profound shift, however, occurred within the silence of our family home in Virginia, where our father had spent years praising Jenna as the singular success story of the Whitford bloodline. After the hearing, Elias Thorne ensured that the 4-inch thick binder of bank statements was delivered directly to my father's hands, allowing him to see the cold, hard numbers that told the true story of the last decade. He spent 3 days poring over the ledger of every wire transfer I had made from overseas, realizing with a crushing weight that I had been the one quietly paying his $500 monthly insulin bills and his $3,000 cardiac copays through Jenna's name for years because she had told him the money came from her surgical bonuses. He didn't call her to offer comfort in her exile. Instead, he called me at 4 a.m, his voice cracking with a raw, sobbing grief I had never heard from him even during our darkest years in the trailer. He cried into the receiver, the sound of a man who realized he had been worshipping a golden calf while the daughter who was actually protecting him was bleeding out in a desert 10,000 miles away. I sat on my porch in the cool Colorado air, listening to the man who had once ignored me finally acknowledge the scars I carried, both the physical ones in my hip and the invisible ones on my soul. He apologized for the decades of being blinded by her brilliance, but the words felt like a soft bandage on a deep shrapnel wound. They helped, but the tissue underneath would never be the same. Jenna's descent into the anonymity of a rural clinic was the final chapter of a myth she had spent her life crafting at my expense. A myth that was now replaced by the grim reality of a paycheck that barely covered her basic needs after the court took its share. I looked at the updated balance on my banking app, seeing the first small restitution payment of $942 trickle back into my account from her garnished earnings, and for the first time, I felt a sense of equilibrium that had nothing to do with money. The golden child was gone, replaced by a woman working in a cinderblock clinic who finally understood the value of a dollar she actually had to earn. I had spent 15 years being a shield, but as I hung up the phone with my father and watched the sun rise over the Rockies, I realized that the greatest service I ever performed wasn't for my country or my sister, but for myself when I finally decided that my dignity was worth more than a one-way loyalty to a family that didn't know how to love me back. The war on the home front was won, and the silence that followed was the sweetest peace I had ever known. I moved to a quiet 10-acre property nestled in the rugged shadows of the Gallatin Range in Montana, a sanctuary purchased with the hard-won settlement money the court finally extracted from Jenna's future earnings and the liquidation of her frozen assets. My new home is a sturdy timber frame cabin with wide plank cedar floors and a wraparound porch that smells of pine resin and the cold, clean promise of high-altitude snow. There are no marble floors here to echo with the sound of designer heels or the sharp, condescending laughter of a woman who viewed me as a utility, only the soft rustle of the wind through the Douglas firs and the distant, rhythmic call of a red-tailed hawk circling the valley. Inside, the walls are decorated with framed topographical maps of the regions I survived and a single modest shadow box containing my Master Sergeant stripes and my Purple Heart, relics of a life I gave to a country and a sister who both took more than they ever intended to give back. I find a strange, profound sense of power in the smallest details of my autonomy, like the digital Nest thermostat on the wall that I keep set to exactly 72 degrees, a luxury I never allowed myself during the 12 years I spent shivering in drafty tents or sweltering in desert heat just to ensure Jenna's luxury apartment in Dallas remained perfectly climate-controlled. Before I disconnected my old life entirely, I sat at the reclaimed oak dining table I bought from a local craftsman for $1,800 and opened my laptop to send Jenna one final, unyielding email. I didn't use her professional title and I didn't offer the sisterly platitudes she had spent a lifetime weaponizing against my conscience. I simply typed the words, "The bank is closed, Clara," and added the finality of a closing tactical report. "Don't look for the key." I hit send and felt the last digital tether snap, a clean break that resonated in the hollow space where my resentment used to live. I walked out onto the porch as the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, painting the big sky in bruised purples and burnt oranges that reminded me of the sunsets over the Hindu Kush, but without the accompanying fear of a mortar strike or the dread of an impending wire transfer request. I sat in a heavy Adirondack chair made of weathered teak, cradling a chipped ceramic mug filled with black coffee that cost me $4 a pound from a local roaster. A humble vessel that felt more valuable than any piece of bone china in Jenna's collection. As the steam rose into the thinning mountain air, I felt the physical weight of 12 years of suppressed trauma and financial servitude finally lift off my chest. A sensation so light it almost made me dizzy. My reconstructed hips still ached with a dull, familiar throb, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a reminder of what I had lost. It felt like a badge of what I had survived. I looked out over my 10 acres of wild Montana grass and realized that while I had spent a decade building a pedestal for a monster, the foundation I was standing on now was entirely my own. The silence of the mountains wasn't empty. It was full of the quiet dignity of a woman who had finally stopped being a shield and started being a person. Family isn't a debt that can never be paid, and blood isn't a contract that requires you to bleed yourself dry for someone who wouldn't hand you a bandage. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, watched the first star blink into existence over the ridge, and finally let the war go. 6 months after the silence of the mountains had become my new normal, a cream-colored envelope arrived in my rural mailbox, its expensive stationery looking absurdly out of place against the backdrop of Montana's rugged pines and gravel roads. I didn't need to break the wax seal to know what was inside. The handwriting was Jenna's unmistakable, performative script, the kind she used when she wanted to appear both professional and profoundly fragile. According to the snippets of gossip that managed to filter through my father, she was now drowning in the reality of a life where a $400 monthly therapy bill was an insurmountable obstacle rather than a rounding error in a budget I had previously balanced for her. She was claiming a deep clinical depression brought on by the loss of her prestige and the weight of her court-mandated restitution, attempting to leverage our shared childhood trauma one last time to see if the Bank of Clara was truly closed for good. I held that envelope in my hands for a long moment, feeling the familiar tug of the old protector I used to be, the woman who would have skipped her own meals to ensure Jenna's mental health was curated by the best specialists money could buy. However, the master sergeant in me looked at the situation with a cold, tactical clarity that years of combat had forged into my very marrow. I didn't open the letter, and I didn't allow her poisonous words to infiltrate the peace I had spent my entire life savings to build. Instead, I walked back into my kitchen, grabbed a black felt tip marker, and wrote the address of the third-party collections agency currently managing her $280,000 educational debt across the front of the envelope in bold, uncompromising strokes. I took it back to the post office the next morning, forwarding her plea for pity to the only people who still had a vested interest in her financial state, effectively treating her emotional manipulation as the business transaction she had always turned our relationship into. Real life had finally begun for the golden child. A life where the light stayed on only if you paid the bill and the consequences of your greed didn't vanish just because you shed a few calculated tears. For the first time since I joined the Air Force at 18, I wasn't there to pay the admission fee for her survival or to act as the shock absorber for the wreckage she left in her wake. I watched the mail truck pull away, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled quickly on the road, and I realized that the lesson I had learned wasn't about the money or the stolen $85,000. I finally understood that being a sister doesn't mean being a doormat, and that loyalty without reciprocity is nothing more than a slow-motion suicide of the soul. My life is now measured in the quiet growth of the garden I'm planting behind the cabin and the steady, painless rhythm of my heart as I wake up each morning without a crisis to solve for a woman who never truly saw me. Jenna's depression was a consequence of her own character. A bill that had finally come due after decades of my subsidies had deferred the payment, and I was no longer interested in being her credit line. As I walked back to my porch, the weight of the world felt lighter than it ever had in the desert or the courthouse, because I finally knew that the only person I was ever truly responsible for saving was the woman currently standing in my boots. I am Clara Whitford, a veteran of 2 wars and 1 family, and for the first time in my 34 years, I am finally irrevocably free. Now my mornings begin not with the jarring blast of a siren or the frantic notification of a bank transfer, but with the steady rhythmic thumping of a golden retriever's tail against the cedar planks of my porch. I spend my days training service dogs for veterans who, like me, returned from the sand and the noise with pieces of themselves missing, helping them find the same grounding and silent companionship that saved my own sanity in the wake of Jenna's betrayal. My life has become small in the most beautiful way possible. A quiet existence carved out of the rugged Montana landscape where every acre is paid for and every breath is entirely my own. There are no more six-figure debts hanging over my head like a guillotine, no more elaborate lies to maintain for the sake of a family reputation that was always a hollow shell, and absolutely no sister lurking in the shadows of my bank account viewing my life as her personal paycheck. I recently sat on my back steps watching a 2-year-old German Shepherd named Rex navigate a complex command sequence, and I realized that the discipline I once used to fund a monster is now being used to heal the men and women who actually understand the meaning of the word sacrifice. The $280,000 I poured into Jenna's education is gone, a sunk cost in the war for my own soul, but the peace I have purchased in its place is worth every cent of the hazardous duty pay I once mistakenly thought was her birthright. Justice, I have found, isn't always the loud, crashing sound of a courtroom gavel or the dramatic public shaming of a golden child. Sometimes justice is nothing more than the soft, final click of a deadbolt locking from the inside. It is the silence of a phone that no longer rings with demands, the stillness of a kitchen where no one is judging the quality of the coffee, and the unwavering clarity of looking in the mirror and seeing a woman who is no longer a doormat for someone else's ambition. I often think back to that courthouse hallway in Virginia, to the charcoal Max Mara coat and the $16 martinis, and it feels like a movie I watched a lifetime ago starring a woman I no longer recognize. I had to perform a radical amputation of my own heart to survive, cutting off the person I loved most in the world to ensure that I didn't bleed out from the wounds she was so happy to inflict. My father still calls occasionally to talk about the weather or the dogs, his voice seasoned with a newfound respect that he never quite knew how to express when Jenna was the center of his universe, and we never mention her name anymore. She is a ghost living in a Mississippi clinic, a lesson in the high cost of entitlement, while I am a living testament to the power of walking away. The weight of 12 years has finally fully lifted, leaving me with a lightness that allows me to hike the mountain trails behind my house without the phantom pain of my injuries dragging me down. I am Clara Whitford, a retired master sergeant, a dog trainer, and a woman who finally learned that loyalty is a two-way street that ends at the gates of self-respect. My life is 100% mine, and as the sun sets over the Gallatin Range casting long, peaceful shadows over the grass, I know that the greatest mission I ever completed was the one where I finally decided to bring myself home. There is a profound, holy kind of power in the realization that you owe nothing to anyone who refuses to see your worth. And as I whistle for the dogs to come inside for the night, I do so with the knowledge that the bank is closed, the doors are locked, and the war is truly finally over.